Journalists, on the other hand, shouldn't have what you called a glass jaw when it comes to some of these investigations, citing the First Amendment and threats to the First Amendment.
Well, the First Amendment is a critically important part of the Constitution. It is not unconditional.
At 86, Tom Brokaw is officially out of dams to give. He's the last of the Titans, the guy who watched the Berlin Wall crumble while the rest of us were still figuring out our VCRs. For a long time, he kept his thoughts on Savannah Guthrie tucked away in a neat, professional box, but the box just flew open. Now, the legend is finally weighing in on the woman who redefined his old stomping grounds, and he's not holding back. The bombshell. So, here's the thing about being 86. You stop caring about the corporate holiday card list. Tom Brokaw has spent half a century being the voice of God, the guy whose vocal cords sounded like expensive mahogany and a very dry martini. He was the gold standard, the man who narrated the end of the 20th century without breaking a sweat or losing his pocket square. But lately, the legendary anchor has been watching the Today Show from a very different vantage point, his ranch, far away from the synthetic glow of Studio 1A, and he finally has some thoughts on the woman currently steering the ship. Enter Savannah Guthrie. When Tom looks at Savannah, he isn't just seeing a news anchor, he's seeing a revolution in a power suit. For years, the rumor mill in the 30 Rock hallways whispered that the old guard, the guys who remember when news was delivered by men with deep voices and zero emotions, weren't exactly thrilled with the new, more caffeinated direction of morning TV. But Brokaw just blew that narrative out of the water. He didn't come out with a dry, prepared statement through a publicist. Instead, he gave us the equivalent of a wink and a nudge, acknowledging that Guthrie isn't just filling in for the legends of the past. She's essentially reinventing the wheel while driving the car at 80 miles per hour. She's got the legal brain of a prosecutor and the relatability of a neighbor, a source close to the veteran anchor suggested. He's been saying behind closed doors. And honestly, that's the ultimate Brokaw compliment. Tom was always the guy who wanted the facts straight, but he also knew how to tell a story. In Savannah, he sees someone who can grill a world leader until they squirm, then pivot effortlessly to a segment about the best air fryer recipes without looking like she's lost her soul. It's a tightrope walk, and Brokaw, the ultimate tightrope walker, finally decided it was time to give her flowers. But let's be real. This isn't just about professional courtesy. There's a bit of spilled tea here, too. The transition from the Brokaw era to the Guthrie era wasn't exactly a smooth paved road. It was more like a distracted drive through a construction zone. When Matt Lauer's career went up in a spectacular mushroom cloud of scandal, the house that Brokaw helped build was shaking at the foundations. There was a moment there where NBC News looked less like a powerhouse and more like a sinking ship. Tom watched from the sidelines as Savannah stepped into that wreckage. He saw her take the hits, handle the awkward on-air apologies, and somehow keep the lights on. Brokaw's recent speaking up isn't a critique, it's a validation. He's essentially saying, "Yeah, I see what you did there." He recognizes that Savannah had to do something he never really had to. She had to be vulnerable. In Tom's day, if an anchor cried on air, people checked the thermostat. In Savannah's day, if you don't show a little humanity, the audience flips the channel to a TikTok compilation of cats. Brokaw's pivot to praising her shows, he's not just an old-timer stuck in 1984. He's a guy who understands that the voice of God has been replaced by the voice of the friend. The irony isn't lost on anyone. Here's the man who reported on the fall of the Berlin Wall, essentially giving a thumbs up to a woman who has to spend 20 minutes of her morning talking about viral memes before she hits the hard politics. Some might have expected him to be grumpy about it, the classic get off my lawn approach to journalism. Instead, he's been surprisingly candid about her steely resolve. He's noted that while his generation was about the delivery, Savannah's generation is about the connection. It's a massive shift in the tectonic plates of broadcast news. Brokaw speaking up now feels like a benediction. It's as if the king of the north just rode down to the south to tell the new queen she's doing a solid job with the dragons. He's noted her prosecutorial edge, a nod to her law degree that she wields like a scalpel during interviews. You can almost see Tom sitting in his leather chair, nodding as Savannah traps a politician in a logic loop. That's the old pro recognizing the new pro. Of course, the internet went wild. People love a Clash of the Titans story, but what they got instead was a passing of the torch that felt surprisingly warm. It wasn't a lecture, it was an observation. Brokaw's voice, though a bit raspier these days, still carries the weight of history. When he says Savannah Guthrie is the real deal, the industry stops and listens. It's the ultimate seal of approval from a man who has seen every fad, every scandal, and every next big thing come and go. He knows that Savannah isn't trying to be him. And more importantly, he knows that the world doesn't want her to be. They want Savannah, the quick-witted, slightly anxious, highly brilliant mother of two, who happens to be the most powerful woman in news. Brokaw's speaking up was the final piece of the puzzle, a bridge between the era of the typewriter and the era of the touchscreen. But before she was the queen of the morning, she was just a kid with a law degree and a dream. Brokaw's Wild West. Before we can really appreciate where Savannah is sitting, we have to look at the dust and gravel that Tom Brokaw had to kick up to build the road in the first place. Imagine a world where the internet didn't exist. News came in on physical paper that smelled like ink and sweat, and the evening news was basically a secular version of church. That was Tom's playground. It wasn't just a job, it was a high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled Wild West where the legends were made of leather and ego. Tom wasn't just a face on a screen. He was the guy who made you feel like the world was ending, but it was okay, because he was the one telling you about it. Tom's story starts in South Dakota, which is about as far from the neon lights of 30 Rock as you can get without hitting a different planet. He was a kid from the prairie, with a voice that sounded like it belonged on a radio before he even hit puberty. But he wasn't just a pretty voice. Tom had this restless energy, a sort of frontier spirit that didn't fit into a 9-to-5 box. He worked his way through the local stations, learning the hard way that in the news business, if you aren't first, you're extinct. By the time he hit the big leagues in the 60s and 70s, the golden age of journalism was just starting to bake, and Tom was right there in the kitchen. Back then, the newsroom wasn't the sterile glass and chrome palace we see today. It was a chaotic, loud, cigarette smoke-filled bunker. There were no teleprompters that worked 100% of the time, no Google to fact-check a senator's lies in 3 seconds, and certainly no social media team to make sure your hair looked on brand for the 6 p.m. slot. It was raw. It was masculine. It was, frankly, a bit of a Shark Tank. Tom thrived in it. He had this uncanny ability to stay cool while the world was literally catching fire around him, whether it was the Watergate scandal or the visceral, heartbreaking reality of the Vietnam War. Brokaw was the steady hand on the tiller. He became part of the Big Three, Jennings, rather, and Brokaw. These guys were more than just anchors. They were the arbiters of truth for 100 million people. If Tom said it happened, it happened. There was a gravity to the role that's hard to explain to someone who grew up with news alerts popping up on their watch. You didn't just check the news, you waited for Tom to give it to you. He traveled the globe, flying into war zones with a notebook and a prayer, proving that he wasn't just a suit who sat behind a desk. He was a reporter's reporter. He was the guy who stood at the Berlin Wall in 1989, sensing the tectonic plates of history shifting beneath his boots, and told the world that the Iron Curtain was finally being shredded. But it wasn't all glory and historical milestones. The Wild West era had a dark side. It was a grueling, life-consuming grind. Brokaw has often talked about the toll it took, the missed birthdays, the holidays spent in hotel rooms in countries most people couldn't find on a map, the constant pressure to be the smartest person in the room. He lived his life in 30-minute increments. The voice of God persona required a level of perfection that would break most people. You couldn't have a bad day when you were the person the country looked to during a national crisis. You had to be bulletproof. And then there was the ego. You don't get to the top of the NBC mountain without a healthy dose of self-belief. The competition between the networks was legendary and often petty. It was a blood sport. Tom wasn't just fighting for ratings, he was fighting for the soul of the American narrative. He was the golden boy, the guy who seemed to have it all: the looks, the brain, the career, and the respect of his peers. But even golden boys get tired. As the 90s bled into the 2000s, the world started to change. The 24-hour news cycle was born, and suddenly, the slow, deliberate pace of the evening news started to feel like a relic. Tom saw the writing on the wall. He knew that the era of the greatest generation, a term he literally coined and turned into a best-selling book, was passing. He was the chronicler of that generation, the man who gave voice to the men and women who survived the Depression and won World War II. In a way, Tom was the bridge between that stoic, do your job and don't complain world, and the hyper-connected, emotional world we live in now. He worked with the giants, he interviewed the monsters and the saints, and he did it all with a level of class that seems almost extinct today. When he finally stepped down from the nightly news chair in 2004, it felt like the end of an empire. People cried. It was the closing of a chapter in American life. But Tom didn't just vanish into the South Dakota sunset. He stayed around, a ghost in the machine, watching as the industry he loved began to fracture. He watched as the internet tore the gatekeepers down. He watched as the news became less about what happened, and more about how do we feel about what happened. And he watched as a young, sharp-as-a-tack lawyer named Savannah Guthrie started making waves in the very building where he'd spent his life. He didn't know it then, but the Wild West was about to get a new sheriff, and she didn't look anything like the guys who came before her. Because while Tom was building the foundation, Savannah was busy learning how to tear down the walls. Savannah's ascent. If Tom Brokaw's career was a slow-burn prestige drama, filmed on 35mm, Savannah Guthrie's rise was more like a high-speed legal thriller edited for the TikTok generation. She didn't come up through the police scanner and local pancake breakfast circuit in the same way the old guard did. Savannah was a different breed of cat entirely. She was a lawyer first, a litigator who knew how to find the crack in a witness's story before they even finished their sentence. When she traded the courtroom for the newsroom, she brought that "don't mess with me" energy into a building that was still arguably a bit of a boys' club. Savannah didn't just walk into 30 Rock and get handed the keys to the kingdom. She had to fight for every inch of sidewalk. She started out doing the grunt work, the kind of reporting where you're standing outside the White House in a freezing drizzle at 4 a.m., waiting for a press secretary who's probably going to lie to you anyway. But there was something about her. She had this approachable brainiac vibe,